The air was crisp and cool, with a temperature of exactly 58.7 degrees Fahrenheit, as the sun began to rise over the vast, open fields of the battlefield. The smell of damp earth and freshly cut grass wafted through the air, mingling with the acrid scent of gunpowder and the sweet metallic tang of oil. The sky above was a deep, foreboding gray, with clouds that seemed to stretch on forever, like an endless sea of cotton candy. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, as the troops on both sides of the conflict prepared for the impending battle. In the distance, the sound of gunfire echoed through the air, a low, rumbling hum that seemed to vibrate through every cell of the body. The guns themselves were a mix of models, with the Allied forces wielding the trusty M1 Garand, a .3006 caliber rifle with the distinctive N-block clip system, while the enemy forces were armed with the sleek, black Carabiner 98K, a 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser rifle with a 5-round internal magazine. The M1 Garand was a reliable, if somewhat cumbersome rifle, with a weight of 9.5 pounds and a length of 43.6 inches, while the Carabiner 98K was a more slender, elegant design, weighing in at 8.4 pounds and measuring 43.7 inches in length. As the soldiers on both sides of the conflict took up their positions, the sound of gunfire grew louder, more insistent, a constant drumbeat that seemed to pulse through the air. The Allies were arrayed in a series of shallow trenches, dug into the earth with pickaxes and shovels, their walls reinforced with sandbags and wooden planks. The trenches were a mixture of fire and support positions, with the fire positions equipped with the M1919 Browning machine gun, a .3006 caliber beast, with a rate of fire of 400 to 600 rounds per minute, and the support positions armed with the M1 81mm mortar, a versatile, indirect fire weapon capable of laying down a withering field of high-explosive fragmentation rounds. The enemy forces, on the other hand, were deployed in a series of strongpoints, heavily fortified positions anchored on key terrain features such as hills, ridges, and road junctions. These strongpoints were equipped with a mixture of machine guns, including the fearsome MG42, a 7.92 by 57 mm monster with a rate of fire of 200 rounds per minute, and the MG34, a 7.92 by 57 mm gun with a rate of fire of 800 to 900 rounds per minute. The enemy forces also had a number of 7.5 cm PaK-40 anti-tank guns, sleek, low-slung weapons with a muzzle velocity of 930 meters per second and a range of 800 meters. As the battle began, the air was filled with the sound of gunfire, the sharp, cracking report of rifles and machine guns, the deeper, more muted thud of mortar rounds and artillery shells. The ground shook beneath the feet of the soldiers, as the earth was torn apart by the explosive force of the various munitions. The smell of smoke and cordite filled the air, a noxious, acrid scent that seemed to burn the lungs and irritate the eyes. The soldiers themselves were a mixture of seasoned veterans and green, inexperienced troops, some of whom were fighting for the first time. They were a diverse group, hailing from different parts of the world, with different languages, cultures, and customs. The Allied forces were led by a grizzled, veteran commander, a man with a wealth of experience and a deep understanding of the battlefield. He was a tall, imposing figure, with a strong jaw and piercing blue eyes, and he wore a pair of wire-rimmed glasses perched on the end of his nose. He was dressed in a worn, faded uniform, with a pair of scratched and dented goggles pushed up onto his forehead. He carried a pair of binoculars, a sturdy, reliable pair of 7 by 50 mm glasses with a rugged, rubberized coating, and a .45 caliber M1911 pistol, a reliable, if somewhat outdated, sidearm with a 7-round magazine. The enemy commander, on the other hand, was a younger, more impetuous man, with a reputation for being reckless and aggressive. He was a short, wiry figure, with a mop of curly black hair and a scar above his left eyebrow. He wore a pair of gold-rimmed glasses, perched on the end of his nose, and he carried a pair of high-quality, Zeiss 10 by 50 mm binoculars, with a sleek, black, leather case. He was dressed in a crisp, well-pressed uniform, with a pair of highly polished boots and a gleaming, silver belt buckle. As the battle raged on, the two commanders stood on opposite sides of the field, each one directing his troops with a series of shouted orders and gestures. The Allied commander stood calmly, his eyes fixed intently on the battlefield, as he directed his troops with a series of crisp, decisive orders. The enemy commander, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of activity, dashing back and forth across the battlefield, shouting orders and encouragement to his troops. He was a mercurial, unpredictable figure, prone to fits of rage and outbursts of temper. and his troops followed him with a mixture of admiration and fear. The battlefield itself was a complex, dynamic environment, with a mixture of different terrain features and obstacles. The ground was a mixture of open fields and wooded areas, with a series of shallow streams and narrow, winding roads. The Allies had deployed a series of barbed wire entanglements, strung across the open fields to funnel the enemy troops into killing zones. The enemy forces had responded by deploying a series of minefields, laid out in a complex pattern of anti-personnel and anti-tank mines. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire and explosions, as the two forces clashed in a frenzy of blood and steel. As the day wore on, the battle showed no signs of slowing down. The two forces were evenly matched, with each side trading blows, and neither gaining the upper hand. The Allies were taking heavy casualties, but they were holding their ground, refusing to yield to the enemy's relentless pressure. The enemy forces, on the other hand, were beginning to show signs of rain, their troops growing tired and disheartened as the battle raged on. The outcome was still far from certain, as the two forces clashed in a frenzy of blood and steel, each one determined to emerge victorious from the carnage. As the battle progressed, the commander of the Allied forces, General James, ordered his troops to execute a pincer movement, aiming to encircle the enemy's flanks and cut off their supply lines. The 1st Battalion, comprising of 800 infantrymen, was tasked with advancing on the eastern flank, utilizing the cover of a nearby forest to conceal their approach. They moved in a staggered formation, with each company maintaining a 50-yard distance from the one preceding it, allowing for a swift and efficient deployment in case of an enemy counterattack. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion, consisting of 900 soldiers, was instructed to launch a diversionary assault on the enemy's western flank, drawing their attention away from the main thrust of the attack. This battalion was divided into 3 companies, each equipped with a distinct set of skills and weaponry. The 1st Company, armed with rifles and machine guns, would provide suppressive fire, pinning down the enemy and preventing them from maneuvering. The 2nd Company, comprising of grenade launcher-equipped troops, would soften up the enemy's defensive positions, creating breaches in their lines. The 3rd Company, an elite group of snipers and scouts, would infiltrate the enemy's rear, gathering vital intel and disrupting their command structures. As the 2nd Battalion initiated its diversionary assault, the 1st Battalion, now emerged from the forest, began its flanking maneuver, advancing in a wide arc to attack the enemy's exposed eastern flank. The Allied troops moved swiftly, taking advantage of the rolling hills and folds in the terrain to remain concealed from enemy view. Their artillery, positioned several miles to the rear, provided covering fire, pounding the enemy's defensive positions and weakening their resolve. The enemy, initially caught off guard by the sudden appearance of the 1st Battalion on their eastern flank, struggled to reorient their defenses and respond to the new threat. Their commanders, attempting to adapt to the changing circumstances, ordered a series of frantic counterattacks, seeking to drive back the Allied troops and regain the initiative. However, these counterattacks were poorly coordinated and lacked the necessary firepower, allowing the Allied forces to repel them with relative ease. As the battle raged on, General James, monitoring the situation from his command center, observed that the enemy's western flank was beginning to waver, threatened by the relentless pressure applied by the 2nd Battalion. Seizing this opportunity, he ordered his 3rd Battalion, a fresh and rested unit, to launch a decisive assault on the enemy's western flank, aiming to shatter their defenses and deliver a crushing blow. The 3rd Battalion, comprising of 1,000 troops, advanced in a dense, columnar formation, presenting a wall of steel and firepower to the enemy. Their leading companies, armed with bayonets and supported by a squadron of tanks, pushed forward with reckless abandon, driving deep into the enemy's positions and creating pockets of chaos and disarray. The enemy, now facing a 3-pronged attack, with the 1st Battalion threatening their eastern flank, the 2nd Battalion pounding their western flank, and the 3rd Battalion advancing directly against their center, began to lose cohesion and discipline. Their commanders, overwhelmed by the sheer scale and intensity of the Allied assault, were unable to maintain order or coordinate an effective response. As the Allied forces continued to push forward, the enemy's defenses began to crumble, and their troops, realizing the futility of further resistance, started to surrender or flee in panic. The Allied forces, having successfully executed their tactical plan, now paused to regroup and reassess the situation. General James, surveying the battlefield, noted that the enemy's western flank had been completely overrun, while their eastern flank was on the verge of collapse. The enemy's center, though still holding, was badly weakened and vulnerable to a final, decisive blow. With his troops rested and replenished, General James prepared to deliver the coup de grace, aiming to shatter the enemy's remaining defenses and secure a crushing victory. The cacophony of war erupted as the Allied forces launched a multifaceted assault on the enemy's stronghold, with artillery fire raining down from the skies and the staccato bursts of machine gun fire echoing through the valleys. The M1 Abrams tanks, with their 120mm smoothbore cannons, led the charge, their composite armor glinting in the sunlight as they traversed the rugged terrain. The tanks' fire control systems, utilizing laser rangefinders and ballistic computers, allowed them to deliver precise and devastating blows to the enemy's fortified positions. As the tanks advanced, they were supported by the relentless drumbeat of the M109A6 Paladin howitzers, which hurled 155mm high-explosive shells at the enemy's defensive emplacements. The Paladin's 39 caliber barrel and modular propulsion system enabled it to achieve a maximum rate of fire of 4 rounds per minute, saturating the battlefield with a maelstrom of explosive ordnance. The howitzers' crews, utilizing advanced fire control systems and precision-guided munitions, were able to deliver pinpoint accurate fire, shattering the enemy's strongpoints and creating breaches in their lines. Meanwhile, the infantry, armed with the M4A1 carbine and M249 SAW, advanced behind the tanks, utilizing the cover provided by the armored behemoths to close with the enemy. The M4A1, with its 14.5-inch barrel and 6-position telescoping stock, allowed the soldiers to engage the enemy at ranges from 50 to 500 meters, while the M249, with its 200-round drum mag, kerosene and rate of fire of 800 rounds per minute, provided a withering field of suppressive fire that pinned down the enemy and prevented them from returning effective fire. As the battle raged on, the air was filled with the whine of helicopters, as the UH-60 Blackhawks and AH-64 Apaches provided close air support to the ground troops. The Apaches, with their 30mm M230 chain guns and Hellfire missiles, swooped down upon the enemy, delivering a maelstrom of firepower that shattered their formations and sent them fleeing in disarray. The Blackhawks, meanwhile, ferried troops and supplies across the battlefield, utilizing their hoists and winches to rapidly reposition units and exploit weaknesses in the enemy's lines. The chaos of battle was everywhere, as soldiers, tanks, and aircraft jostled for position on the crowded battlefield. The stench of smoke and sweat hung heavy in the air, mingling with the acrid tang of propellant and the sweet scent of blood. The earth shook beneath the feet of the soldiers, as the thunder of artillery and the crash of explosions threatened to deafen them. The very fabric of reality seemed to be torn asunder, as the disciplined ranks of the military clashed in a frenzy of steel and fire. In the midst of this maelstrom, the commanders and staff officers huddled in their command centers, poring over maps and intelligence reports as they struggled to maintain a semblance of order on the battlefield. The din of war was distant, muffled by the thin, CK walls of the command bunker. But the tension was palpable, as the officers knew that the fate of the battle hung precariously in the balance. They worked tirelessly, directing troops and tanks, calling in airstrikes, and adjusting their strategy to counter the enemy's every move. The flow of logistics was a critical factor in the battle, as the military's vast supply chain struggled to keep pace with the insatiable demands of the fighting troops. The tanks and aircraft required constant replenishment of fuel and ammunition, while the infantry needed food, water, and medical supplies to sustain them in the face of the enemy's relentless onslaught. The logisticians, utilizing advanced computer systems and satellite communications, worked tirelessly to ensure that the flow of supplies remained uninterrupted, even as the battle raged on. The maintenance of the military's equipment was another critical factor, as the tanks, aircraft, and other vehicles required constant upkeep to remain operational. The mechanics and technicians worked around the clock, performing repairs and maintenance tasks, even as the battle raged on. The M1 Abrams tank, for example, required a team of highly trained technicians to maintain its complex systems, including its gas turbine engine, transmission, and fire control computer. The UH-60 Blackhawk helicopter, meanwhile, required regular maintenance to its rotor blades, engines, and avionics systems in order to ensure that it remained airworthy and capable of performing its mission. As the battle reached its climax, the outcome hung precariously in the balance. The enemy was formidable, well-trained, and well-equipped, and they would not relinquish their strongholds without a fierce struggle. The Allied forces, however, were determined to emerge victorious, and they threw everything they had into the fray. The tanks and infantry surged forward, supported by the relentless bombardment of the artillery and the withering firepower of the aircraft. The enemy lines wavered, and then began to break, as the Allied forces exploited the weaknesses in their defenses and poured through the gaps like a flood. In the end, it was the sheer weight of the Allied forces, firepower, combined with their superior training and logistics, that proved too much for the enemy to bear. The enemy's strongholds were reduced to rubble, their troops were broken and fleeing, and their command structure was shattered. The Allies had emerged victorious, but at great cost, as the battlefield was littered with the wreckage of destroyed vehicles, the bodies of the dead and wounded, and the detritus of war. The survivors, exhausted and shell-shocked, surveyed the devastation, knowing that they had been a part of something momentous, something that would be remembered for generations to come. As the cacophony of war reached a deafening crescendo, the battlefield transformed into a maelstrom of chaos, where the very fabric of reality seemed to unravel. The air was heavy with the acrid smell of smoke and sweat, as the warriors on both sides clashed in a frenzy of steel and fire. The earth trembled beneath the feet of the combatants, as if the land itself was being torn asunder by the conflict. Every second was a lifetime, as the soldiers fought for every inch of ground, their lives hanging precariously in the balance. A misstep, a miscalculation, or a moment of hesitation could prove fatal, as the enemy was relentless in their pursuit of victory. The clash of steel on steel echoed through the air, a deadly symphony that seemed to have no end, as the warriors danced and parried, their movements a blur of speed and deception. The ground was slick with the blood of the fallen, as the cries of the wounded filled the air, a haunting chorus that seemed to pierce the very soul. The living stumbled and fell, their bodies broken and battered, as they struggled to rise again, driven by a fierce determination to survive. The battle was a vortex, a whirlpool of violence that drew in all who dared to enter, and spit out the dead and the dying, like so much chaff in the wind. Time lost all meaning, as the combatants fought on, driven by a primal urge to destroy, to conquer, and to emerge victorious. The world narrowed to a single, razor-sharp focus, as each warrior faced their own personal demon, their own nemesis, in the midst of the chaos. A bullet whizzed past, a hair's breadth from the ear, as a nearby explosion sent shrapnel flying, wrecking, like a deadly hail of razor-sharp shards. The sound was a living thing, a creature that wrapped itself around the mind and squeezed until the very sanity of the warrior was threatened. In this maelstrom of violence, where the laws of humanity seemed to have been torn asunder, there were moments of clarity, of lucid insight, that seemed to pierce the veil of chaos. A soldier saw a comrade fall, and in that instant, the world seemed to slow, as if time itself was bending to accommodate the horror of the moment. The cry of the fallen echoed through the mind, a haunting reminder of the fragility of life, as the survivor stumbled forward, driven by a desperate need to avenge, to protect, and to survive. A grenade exploded, sending shrapnel flying, like a deadly rain of molten steel, as the warriors scrambled for cover, their bodies seeking the shelter of any available refuge. The sound was a deafening roar, a creature that consumed all in its path, leaving nothing but destruction and despair in its wake. And yet, even in the midst of this chaos, there were moments of beauty, of transcendent courage, as the warriors rose above the fray, their spirits unbroken, their will to survive burning bright, like a beacon in the darkness. A machine gun spat out its deadly rhythm, a staccato beat that seemed to punctuate the very fabric of reality. As the warriors advanced, their movements a slow, relentless march into the jaws of hell. The earth itself seemed to shudder, as if the aisle and was being torn apart as the artillery boomed and thundered, a living, breathing creature that devoured all in its path. The world was a kaleidoscope of colors, a swirling vortex of sound and fury, as the warriors stumbled forward, driven by a fierce determination to emerge victorious, to survive the unimaginable, and to rise above the chaos. In this crucible of violence, where the very limits of human endurance were being tested, there were moments of transcendence, of epiphany, that seemed to pierce the veil of reality. A warrior saw the face of their enemy, and in that instant, the world seemed to shift, as if the very nature of the conflict had been altered. The enemy was no longer a faceless, monolithic entity, but a human being, with hopes, fears, and dreams, just like themselves. The warrior saw the similarity, the shared humanity, and in that moment, the conflict seemed to lose its meaning, its purpose, as if the very justification for the violence had been torn away. The battle raged on, a seemingly endless vortex of violence, as the warriors fought for every inch of ground, their lives hanging precariously in the balance. The earth was scorched, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and sweat, as the combatants clashed in a frenzy of steel and fire. The world was a maelstrom, a whirlpool of chaos, as the warriors stumbled forward, driven by a fierce determination to survive, to emerge victorious, and to rise above the carnage. And in the midst of this chaos, there were moments of clarity, of lucid insight, that seemed to pierce the veil of reality, revealing the true nature of the conflict and the humans who fought it. As the battle reached its climax, the warriors were consumed by a primal urge to destroy, to conquer, and to emerge victorious. The world narrowed to a single, razor-sharp focus, as each warrior faced their own personal demon, their own nemesis, in the midst of the chaos. The sound was a living thing, a creature that wrapped itself around the mind and squeezed until the very sanity of the warrior was threatened. The earth trembled, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and sweat, as the combatants clashed in a frenzy of steel and fire, their lives hanging precariously in the balance. In this vortex of violence, where the very limits of human endurance were being tested, there were moments of transcendence, of epiphany, that seemed to pierce the veil of reality. The warriors saw the face of their enemy, and in that instant, the world seemed to shift, as if the very nature of the conflict had been altered. The enemy was no longer a faceless, monolithic entity, but a human being, with hopes, fears, and dreams, just like themselves. The warriors saw the similarity, the shared humanity. And in that moment, the conflict seemed to lose its meaning, its purpose. As if the very justification for the violence had been torn away. The battle raged on, a seemingly endless vortex of violence, as the warriors fought for every inch of ground, their lives hanging precariously in the balance. The earth was scorched, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and sweat, as the combatants clashed in a frenzy of steel and fire. The world was a maelstrom, a whirlpool of chaos, as the warriors stumbled forward, driven by a fierce determination to survive, to emerge victorious, and to rise above the carnage. And in the midst of this chaos, there were moments of clarity, of lucid insight, that seemed to pierce the veil of reality, revealing the true nature of the conflict and the humans who fought it. The outcome was far from certain, as the warriors clashed in a frenzy of steel and fire, their lives hanging precariously in the balance, as the world teetered on the brink of chaos. The once pristine landscape was now a scene of unmitigated devastation, a grim testament to the unrelenting ferocity of war. The air reeked of smoke, sweat, and the acrid stench of burnt flesh, an odor that seemed to sear itself into the nostrils and cling to every available surface. The ground, once a vibrant green, was now a dull, muddy brown, churned up by the relentless treads of tanks and the frenzied scrambling of soldiers. Every step revealed a new horror, a fresh atrocity that seemed to defy the very fabric of humanity. As the survivors stumbled through the wreckage, they were met with a haunting silence, a stillness that seemed to swallow all sound and leave only an oppressive, crushing emptiness. The only noise occurring was the faint, pitiful cries of the wounded, their desperate pleas for help echoing through the desolate landscape like the mournful wails of lost souls. The soldiers, their faces blackened by smoke and grime, their eyes sunken with fatigue and shock, moved with a mechanical, zombie-like gait, their movements driven by a grim, desperate necessity. The casualty reports were staggering, a grim litany of death and destruction that seemed to go on forever. The numbers were almost incomprehensible, a mind-numbing tally of shattered lives and broken bodies. The medics, their faces set in grim, determined lines, worked tirelessly to stem the tide of blood, their hands moving with a swift, practiced precision as they fought to save the lives of the wounded. But despite their best efforts, the deaths continued to mount, each one a fresh, bitter tragedy that seemed to tear at the very heart of the survivors. Individual stories of survival began to emerge, each one a testament to the indomitable human spirit, a beacon of hope in a landscape ravaged by war. There was the story of Private Johnson, who had been buried under a pile of rubble for hours, his screams for help growing hoarse and faint as the minutes ticked by. Yet, even as all seemed lost, he had managed to summon the last vestiges of his strength, digging his way out of the wreckage with a fierce, desperate determination. His face was a mess of cuts and bruises, his eyes blackened by the dust and debris, but he was alive, a miracle in a world gone mad. Then there was the story of Sergeant Thompson, who had lost his entire squad in a brutal surprise attack. Though his own body was riddled with shrapnel, he had managed to crawl to safety, his mind clouded by shock and grief. As he stumbled through the ruins, he had come across a small, frightened child, no more than 10 years old, cowering in the corner of a bombed-out building. Without hesitation, Thompson had scooped up the child, cradling it in his arms as he stumbled through the wreckage, searching for medical help. It was a moment of pure, selfless courage, a testament to the enduring power of humanity, even in the darkest of times. As the survivors struggled to come to terms with the scale of the disaster, they were met with a fresh, daunting challenge: the need to regroup, to reorganize, and to press on. It was a task of monumental difficulty, one that seemed to require superhuman strength and endurance. Yet, even as the soldiers stumbled and faltered, they knew that they could not give up, that they had to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. For in the end, it was not the falling that mattered, but the getting back up, the refusal to yield to the overwhelming forces of chaos and destruction. The landscape itself seemed to be a constant reminder of the devastation, a grim, unyielding presence that weighed heavily on the minds and hearts of the survivors. Every step revealed a new horror, a fresh atrocity that seemed to defy the blurry fabric of humanity. The rubble-strewn streets, the shattered buildings, the twisted, rusting hulks of cars and tanks, all seemed to bear witness to the unrelenting fury of war, a fury that had torn apart the very fabric of society. And yet, even amidst this destruction, there were glimmers of hope, small, tentative beacons of light that seemed to flicker in the darkness. A group of soldiers, their faces set in determined lines, had managed to establish a makeshift medical center, a place where the wounded could receive some semblance of care and comfort. It was a primitive, ramshackle affair, but it was a start, a first, tentative step towards rebuilding and recovery. Nearby, a small band of survivors had begun to clear the rubble, their faces set in grim, determined lines as they worked to uncover the bodies of the dead. It was a gruesome, heartbreaking task, but it was necessary, a vital part of the process of healing and rebuilding. As the day wore on, the survivors continued to struggle, their movements driven by a grim, desperate necessity. They knew that they had to keep moving, to keep pushing forward, no matter the cost. For in the end, it was not the falling that mattered, but the getting back up, the refusal to yield to the overwhelming forces of chaos and destruction. And so they stumbled on, their faces set in determined lines, their hearts heavy with grief, and their spirits battered by the relentless fury of war. Yet, even amidst this devastation, there was a sense of hope, a sense that somehow, some way, they would emerge from this darkness, scarred and battered, but alive. As we conclude our comprehensive analysis of the historical events that have shaped the world, it becomes increasingly evident that the long-term geopolitical implications are far-reaching and profound. The intricate web of alliances, conflicts, and diplomatic maneuvers has led to a complex landscape that continues to evolve to this day. The legacy of past actions reverberates through the corridors of time, influencing the decisions of world leaders and the fate of nations. In the aftermath of the Cold War, the world witnessed a significant shift in the global balance of power. The dissolution of the Soviet Union marked the end of a bipolar world order, paving the way for the emergence of the United States as the sole superpower. This newfound dominance enabled the U.S. to exert its influence across the globe, shaping international relations, and promoting its interests through a combination of diplomacy, economic coercion, and military intervention. However, the unchecked power of the United States has also led to a rise in anti-American sentiment, as nations and populations began to feel the effects of U.S. hegemony. The invasion of Iraq, the war on terror, and the proliferation of drone strikes have all contributed to a growing perception that the U.S. is a unilateral actor, bent on imposing its will on the world through military force. This has led to a proliferation of anti-U.S. alliances and a resurgence of nationalist movements, as countries seek to assert their sovereignty and resist the encroachment of American power. Meanwhile, the rise of China has introduced a new dynamic into the global equation. As the world's second-largest economy, China has begun to challenge American dominance, promoting its own brand of authoritarian capitalism and seeking to expand its influence across Asia and beyond. The Belt and Road Initiative, a grandiose infrastructure project aimed at connecting China with Europe and Africa, has raised concerns about the potential for Chinese economic and military expansion, and the implications this may have for regional stability. In Europe, the European Union has struggled to maintain its cohesion and relevance in the face of rising nationalism and economic instability. The migrant crisis, the Brexit debacle, and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine have all served to highlight the fragility of the European project and the need for greater cooperation and solidarity among member states. As the EU navigates these challenges, it must also contend with the growing influence of external actors, including Russia, China, and the United States, each of which seeks to shape the continent's future in accordance with its own interests. In the Middle East, the legacy of colonialism and the aftermath of the Arab Spring continue to shape the region's politics and societies. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains a festering wound, with no lasting solution in sight. The rise of Iran has introduced a new variable into the regional equation, as Tehran seeks to expand its influence through proxy forces and strategic alliances. The ongoing war in Yemen, the struggle for dominance in Syria, and the perpetual unrest in Libya all serve to underscore the complexity and unpredictability of the Middle East, a region that remains a crucible of conflict and instability. As we reflect on these developments, it becomes clear that the world is entering a new era of great power competition, one that will be characterized by rising tensions, shifting alliances, and an increasing reliance on military force. The legacy of past conflicts continues to shape the present, as nations and leaders grapple with the consequences of their actions and the uncertainties of the future. In this context, it is more important than ever to understand the complexities of history, to appreciate the nuances of geopolitics, and to recognize the enduring power of ideas and ideals in shaping the course of human events. And so, as we bring this series to a close, we are reminded that the study of history is not merely an academic exercise, but a vital tool for navigating the complexities of the present and the uncertainties of the future. By examining the past, we can gain a deeper understanding of the forces that shape our world, and develop a more nuanced appreciation for the complexities and challenges that lie ahead. As the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus once said, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man." In this sense, our understanding of the world is always provisional, always subject to revision and refinement, as we strive to make sense of the ever-changing landscape of human experience. In conclusion, I hope that this series has provided you with a deeper understanding of the historical context that shapes our world today. If you've enjoyed this journey through the ages, please consider subscribing to our channel, where we'll continue to explore the complexities of history, geopolitics, and the human condition. By subscribing, you'll gain access to a wealth of knowledge, insights, and perspectives that will help you navigate the challenges of the 21st century. So join us on this ongoing journey of discovery. And together, let's explore the intricacies of the past, the complexities of the present, and the uncertainties of the future. Subscribe now, and let's continue to illuminate the path forward, one episode at a time.